Dr. Ford, whenever you want to get started, we can go ahead and we'll just let people trickle in.
Okay, are there many people wandering still out in the vestibule, or are there, well, why don't we'll get started, and I know we'll all be together again tomorrow too. So, well, again, welcome everybody to the 2021 Clinical Research Forum IT Roundtable. I'm Dan Ford. I've been the one of the leaders of the IT Roundtable for I guess almost 20 years. It's almost that long. And we certainly see how the world has changed. I was saying that when we first started this, it was all about, are we going to pick electronic medical records, and which one would it be? And will we ever have a research data warehouse? Would we ever be able to communicate with patients about research through the EMR? And I said, now we don't just have one research data warehouse, we have 2 or 3. Our data is going to multiple places. So the access to the data is really entirely different than where we were at 20 years ago. On the other hand, it does create some new challenges, right, that we need to think about, right? So, I mean, I think we do have to be really thinking about, are we the solution to helping to improve the health of the American public? We have really hit a rough patch, and I don't know if it's just COVID or not, but and I saw where Francis Collins has certainly been getting some tough questions as well, that life expectancy actually has not gone up really at all while he has been the director of the NIH. And wait till you see what's going to happen when we look at life expectancy in the last couple of years as we get more information with that. And so we need to decide as a how are we making an impact that's going to really get the outcomes that the public is expecting? We have real issues about the research workforce, which again reflects the general economy, and we're going to have a session about that tomorrow as well, where everybody is struggling to have the workforce, the trained, stable workforce that is needed to do much of what we need to do in clinical research, and research IT is certainly seeing that same challenge. Clinician burnout, I do think we're seeing that right now, whether it's physicians, nurses, or whatever, their willingness to help with research or engage in research is a little bit less right now, just because I think they're in a self-preservation mode and saying, okay, I have to deal with my top priority, and maybe I can give you a little bit of time, but they're really very guarded about taking on any extra responsibility. And then, where do we fall in the trust of the public? It's still kind of amazing to me that that use of EMR data for research has not gotten hung up in the big politics that seem to be plaguing the United States right now, although we're not immune from it. I had to take a patient complaint today about a research invitation that she received through MyChart, and she was totally upset about who had been looking at her data, and how is the permission, and how is this now going to be in her medical record, and who was going to be able to see it later. So it's there. I mean, our complaints are 1 in 10,000, but it's there, and we have to really guard it. We have been, I think, exceptionally good right now at not allowing misuse of EHR data for that we gather for research to be used for business or promotion. We've really been extremely good, but we have to keep an eye on that, because the public is waiting for a reason not to trust us. That's the way I would phrase it. So again, I think there's reasons for us to really focus over tonight and tomorrow. And we're very fortunate to have a planning committee. Kim, if you want to just move that. There we go. For me, it's been great to see the IT Roundtable Planning Committee really come forward. I feel many of these are the next generation that don't really remember what it was like in the very beginning, and that's great. And I'm really looking to pass on the leadership to people that are, starting their career at a different time and have a different idea of what the challenges are and what they need to address. So I'm really thankful for everybody on the planning committee, and they'll be participating in many of the sessions tomorrow. And I want to thank our sponsors, both Epic and Trinetics, that have joined us again this year and will be available tomorrow and participate in some of our sessions, and certainly be there to help in the conversation that we always look forward to. So tonight, I want to just give you a little background on the keynote presentation. We're really fortunate to have Patrick Ryan join us tonight. He, was educated in the engineering school at Cornell with his BA and master's, and then did his PhD in UNC in the pharmaceutical outcomes, or the pharmacoepi program. And since then, he's been really one of the leaders in trying to use the most rigorous methodology and approaches to understand what we can learn from EMR or real world evidence. He was one of the principal investigators for the OMOP, a public-private partnership with FDA on how to assess the appropriate use of real-world evidence. And right now, he is the Vice President for Observational Health Analytics at Janssen, and an assistant professor, adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Biomedical Informatics at Columbia. And, interestingly, I was trying to contact Patrick earlier with one of the recommendations from the planning committee, and we were having a little trouble exchanging emails. And sure enough, I turned into the biomedical grand rounds at Hopkins, and I said, "There's Patrick Ryan. This is really good. I didn't even know he was going to do a presentation." I said, "Patrick, would you be willing to join us?" And he said yes. And we really appreciate you joining with us tonight, and we look forward to your presentation. So it's all yours, Patrick.
Great, thank you, Dan, and I thank the Clinical Research Forum for having me, and look forward to a nice conversation. I know, as Diana already said, it's 7 o'clock. Lots of Zoom fatigue for many of us. I see Eric's still wearing a tie. I'm hoping that you didn't put that on just for me. And I'm going to envision, since it's the end of the day, that at least you have pajama bottoms below that shirt and tie. I'm looking forward to having a conversation. I know we've got, this is an evening conversation that we're supposed to be having here. I think what Dan kind of gave me a charge to do is provide you a little bit of a perspective on real world evidence, and particularly from the vantage point of you all as clinical research informatics officers, and thinking about the role of providing research data and kind of expanding that to the responsibilities associated with not just the data, but the actual evidence itself, and some opportunities that we could have to actually bring that all together. Just quick logistics check. You guys can see my screen now?
Yeah, fine.
Cool. Very good. All right, so I'm gonna try to stick to about like a 30-minute time. I'm gonna ask that if you have any questions along the way, please post them in the chat. I'm gonna have that open on my other window, and if I see questions that I can answer along the way, I will. Otherwise, we'll certainly make time for Q&A at the end here. So I'm gonna give a lens that's relatively recent. I guess I currently kind of classify the world into the before times, pre-pandemic, and then the after times. And I'm hoping that there's an after times, but right now we're not there yet. So immediately in the before times, actually, I should disclose. So as Dan highlighted, so I'm at Janssen, I'm at Columbia. I help to coordinate the Odyssey community. I'm going to be sharing some opinions that might sound provocative. They're all my own. None of these organizations would actually want to embrace me here. So you remember that the pandemic started in earnest in like March of 2020. There was a paper that was published right at the very start. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine that got some attention among some folks like myself who try to make a living thinking about how we can use data captured during routine clinical care through electronic health records or other sources as a primary vehicle for doing clinical research. It was a paper published by Rory Collins that was entitled "The Magic of Randomization versus the Myth of Real-World Evidence." Diana, you're smiling. Did you see this one come out too? Yeah, so it basically tried to describe how maybe it'd be possible to use observational data from electronic health records to generate real-world evidence, and there may be some use cases where that could be useful. However, the typical argument that we've all been hearing for a few decades, observational data, it's not a randomized trial, it's not a rigorous data source, it's inherently has lots of bias, and therefore I'm not really sure we can actually trust anything that comes out of this. This has been a typical, boring, tired argument that we've been hearing over and over again. Now, this was right at the start of the pandemic when we didn't have an immediate obvious need, that we actually had a burning fire to actually solve some problems that maybe a clinical trial wasn't going to be able to solve for us. But actually, only like a few months later, other esteemed colleagues, Rob Califf was actually the lead author of this at the time. This is former FDA commissioner, then at Verily, now to be next FDA commissioner, Rob Califf, who published a paper in JAMA in July that basically, the title was "Weighing the Benefits and Risks of Proliferating Observational Treatment Assessments, Observational Cacophony or Randomized Harmony," and basically playing the same trope about all this work doing retrospective analysis of observational healthcare data. We're generating information. Is it actually trustworthy, actionable evidence? Or would we be better off spending our resources to just do better clinical trials? And again, this is July, and the time when we're still trying to actually figure out what the heck this COVID-19 thing was, and also trying to figure out the effectiveness of various treatments that we were trying at the time. Now, that was at the start of the after times. Now I'm going to fast forward ahead to just a couple weeks ago. November 19th, so 2 weeks ago now, our colleagues at the European Medicines Agency just published this perspective paper in Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics entitled "Real-World Evidence in EU Medicines Regulation, Enabling Use and Establishing Value." And the fundamental thesis of this is that their vision is that by 2025, the use of real-world evidence will be enabled and its value will be established across a spectrum of regulatory use cases, and that the EMA is committed to working with stakeholders to deliver this vision and in turn support the development and use of better medicines for patients. So instead of saying, well, we should just abandon this thing, we've got regulators on the other side of the pond actually saying, we actually need to work together to actually figure out how to make this happen. And fast forward ahead to yesterday, the FDA just issued yet another draft guidance about how to use real-world data and support real-world evidence for supporting regulatory decision-making. And this document that just came out yesterday specifically talks about how the 21st Century Cures Act, its goal was to try to figure out how to accelerate medicine development, bring innovations faster, more efficiently to the patients who need them. And as part of that, the FDA actually was required to create a real-world evidence framework. And this particular guidance that just came out yesterday was specifically about how real-world evidence can support the approval of new indications for drugs that are already approved, or to support post-marketing study requirements. Now, I know many of you are in academic medical centers, you aren't necessarily always doing regulatory science, but I think it's a startling juxtaposition to think about. Less than 2 years ago, we've got several leading academic experts saying, like, what the hell are we doing? And then we've got regulators on both sides of the pond basically saying, how do we actually enable these data to actually support important policy decisions that could impact things? Now, I would actually assert that neither of these groups are necessarily wrong, but there's a perspective about why are people so skeptical about observational evidence. And there's also reason for belief that we can do better and actually make that evidence be regulatory grade if we think of that as putting that on a pretty high echelon. And part of the challenge is that when we think about this problem, the journey to go from data, which you all are expert about, to evidence is a pretty difficult task right now. And there's lots of different types of observational data captured during routine course of clinical care. And those different types of data reflect different populations, different care settings, different data capture processes, different health systems. And so when we say real world data, we're not talking about one thing, but we're talking about an entire complex constellation of different things. And when people talk about real world evidence, we're oftentimes talking past each other because we're talking about different types of analytic use cases. Sometimes we're interested in clinical characterization to support clinical trial feasibility, treatment utilization, disease natural history. Sometimes we're thinking about doing causal inference, answering questions about comparative effectiveness or safety surveillance. And sometimes we're interested in applying machine learning algorithms to do patient level prediction. So there isn't just one type of real world data, and there isn't just one type of real world evidence, but no matter what you're trying to do, if you're trying to learn from data, that process currently in our current ecosystem is hard for pretty much every stakeholder that's involved in it. And I would actually argue that the way in which we generate evidence from data creates a problem where we can't actually build trust in the evidence that we produce. As many of you are actually actively involved on, a research question starts with trying to curate the right data to figure out a question. Then we go through some sort of process to select the cohorts, define the populations of interest that we want to study for an individual question. At that point, the data may be handed over to some statisticians or somebody who can implement an analysis on the data set, generating some sort of inferences or statistical estimators. And then at that point, a clinical team will take those statistics and actually try to disseminate the evidence. And we oftentimes do that through things like writing peer review publications. And it's at that moment that somebody bothers to ask the question, is the evidence reliable? And so you get this paper and you look at it and you say, well, geez, why are the reasons I'm not going to trust this information that just came from this EHR system? And those issues could be methodologic concerns. So everybody wants to throw around issues of where's the bias, what's the confounding or the selection bias or that actually exists in the statistical choices that have been made. People will talk about misclassification errors, so measurements associated with phenotype evaluation. And did you even find the right clinical people of interest? And right now, lots of people want to talk about data quality and fitness for use and the issues associated with whether or not a database has been appropriately curated. But all this happens at the point that they get the piece of evidence and they're trying to decide whether or not that they want to trust that. And really the question that they're asking is, does a study provide an unbiased effect estimate? And are the findings generalizable to the population that I care about? But if I'm sitting there holding an evidence and I got all these reasons to believe that all the process that took me to that piece of evidence are potentially fraught with issues, then it's really hard for me to trust that piece of evidence. And that doesn't even go on to the point that there are also technical issues associated with this process. Because we don't share data and we don't share analysis and we don't share our processes, I'm left with this PDF document of an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper that describes in a free text paragraph the methods that were applied to an analysis to generate evidence. And I have to ask questions like, well, how do I actually know that the programming that the statisticians ran was actually correct? Or how do I know that logic that was used to extract the clinical idea from the data was actually appropriate and relevant? Or presumably the data came from some original source, was transformed in some sort of way, whether it be into a research warehouse or some analytic flat file. How did that transformation get done? And how do I actually know that that's correct? So we're actually in a process right now where there's data trying to get to this point of evidence. But at the point that we actually hand over the evidence, we don't necessarily trust the process we used to generate the evidence from the data. And so we're left with a situation where folks who instead think about prospective collection of data, monitoring every single step of the way, pre-specification of analysis, and rational design of analysis feel like they can trust their evidence because they've been along the journey all the way through this process. But we on the side of retrospective analysis and non-interventional studies, secondary use of clinical data, we're oftentimes in this trust me science, where we do our best to get through the process and then someone else is going to tell us all the reasons why they don't necessarily trust the work we've done. So I've been reflecting a lot about this problem and trying to figure out what can we actually do differently, because we can't just keep going on generating evidence that nobody else is going to trust unless you're a believer in the trust me science. And I'll actually assert that one of the big developments that we've seen is not just using one database at a time, but actually now using networks of databases. And indeed, having more data in a network of data can be useful, but actually what it actually does is it just makes this problem even more complicated. Because now instead of curating one database, I'm curating a network of databases. I'm now trying to figure out whether or not phenotypes are actually applicable across the network. And now I've got different questions. Is the study result consistent across the network? What do I do with heterogeneity across the network? And if I couldn't trust that a study could be done at one institution, how in the world am I supposed to believe that it can be fully reproduced across a network of institutions? And so while more data is almost certainly a good thing, more data also introduces complications to our processes. So we've been thinking about we shouldn't just talk about the journey from data to evidence, but we should also talk about how do we make evidence reliable? And I would assert that there's some basic attributes about evidence that we should try to aspire to. We should do science that is repeatable. Same researcher given the same data, applying the same analysis should get the same answer. Unfortunately, because many of us take this as a bespoke journey through our data, that's not always guaranteed. We'd really like our research to be reproducible so that any researcher given the same data with the same analysis could yield the same result. That requires a level of transparency that most of our research institutions do not have. We'd like our work to be replicable such that not just performing an identical analysis of the identical data set, but actually if you had a similar population and you apply identical analysis, could you get a similar answer? Well, to do that, you actually need coordination across multiple sites. We'd like results to be generalizable so that you're not just looking at a similar population and a similar data capture process, but is the effect actually consistent across different types of data? You'd like your results to be robust, that is, alternative analysis choices that could be made would hold up to produce consistent results. And you'd like your results to be calibrated, meaning that actually those statistical inferences you're drawing, the statistical estimates, would be a relative risk or a p-value or a confidence interval, that actually you know that you can trust and interpret those as truly reflective, unbiased estimates. And the challenge is pretty much all observational data published today fails at one or more or most or all of these required attributes of reliable evidence. And so we're actually in a situation where we generate evidence, but we can't prove that it's reliable. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about as it relates to that problem is how do we actually not just hope that people will believe our evidence, but actually prove that our evidence is reliable, and that when we generate evidence, we also can generate some sort of evidence of the reliability of the clinical answers that we have. So all of this actually comes from the lens of as Dan introduced, I'm working as part of the Odyssey community. I recognize some friendly faces and names here. But for those of you who don't know, Odyssey is an open science community. Our mission is to improve health by empowering a community to collaboratively generate evidence that promotes better health decisions. So we're trying to use observational data to generate evidence that is reliable and actionable and supportive of some sort of medical decisions that are out there. The Odyssey community, it's an international community. It's grown quite large. We now have over 2,300 collaborators in 74 countries. And we've built a data network now of over 331 data sources in 34 countries, collectively representing over 800 million unique patient records. Now, several of you on the call, I've got folks here from Johns Hopkins, from Geisinger, from Yale, from Case Western. You all have inside your institutions somebody who is participating in the Odyssey community, have data converted into this network, which makes it at least theoretically possible that we can collaborate on research together. Now, the way that Odyssey works as an open science community is we collaborate on various collective activities. Our collaborations really span 4 primary pillars of our work. We collaborate on open community data standards. Specifically, we're the community that is supporting the OMOP common data model and its adoption around the world. We collaborate on open source analytics development. So we build freely available software tools that run against the OMOP common data model. We conduct methodological research, so we're conducting experiments to try to establish scientific best practices. And then we collaborate together to actually generate evidence of particular questions of interest to the community. Now within Odyssey, we also have a data network. It's a distributed data network. What that means is each database who voluntarily participates converts their source data, whether it be in whatever form or their research warehouse or whatever it might be, convert it into a standardized representation of patient level data. That's the OMOP common data model. And those sites also implement the open source standardized tools that run against that common data model. This distributed network, what that means is the collaborations for the data standards and the open source tools are explicitly to support this network of organizations. So several of you, your organizations have a copy of your data converted to the OMOP common data model. You've got software that's actually running that can actually take advantage of that data. And this network of hundreds of databases now has the possibility that when analysis questions are asked, which we refer to as network studies, that basically means a pre-specified protocol with an analysis specification codified as open source software. That code is made publicly available. Sites can choose to opt in to participate in a study, download that code, bring it within their firewall, and they can choose to share back aggregate summary statistics from the network. And then those aggregate summary statistics are collated together, and collaboratively as a community, we interpret those statistics and disseminate the evidence. Now, anybody can participate in this. It's free to participate, to be an Odyssey collaborator. And we've done a lot of international studies under this model, whereby we've been trying to just answer questions that actually matter, taking advantage of the data and trying to get all the way through that pipeline to some evidence that we consider to be reliable. The OMOP common data model, of course, as Dan was saying, like you went from a place where you weren't sure whether you could do any data to now the place where you got multiple instances of research warehouses standardized in lots of different formats. This is just a data model. Our real focus in the Odyssey community actually isn't about data standards as the end game, but rather data standards as a means to the end game, which is we need to enable data to be standardized if we're going to develop standardized analytics that can actually be applied across disparate data. And to do that, we need to standardize not only the data structure, which is represented in this kind of cartoon ER diagram, but also we have to standardize the content of the data. And so we've actually spent a huge amount of effort over the last decade developing standardized vocabularies to allow us to map individual source vocabularies that you might have in your own institution into standard languages so we can speak the same language across databases around the world. The Odyssey Vocabulary, which is also publicly available to just download, has over 9 million concepts in it, over 75 million concept relationships, and over 130 different vocabularies, which means that we can actually start to standardize different data domains in common dialects. So we take data, we preserve it in its source content, we standardize the structure, and then we standardize the content into these auxiliary vocabularies, which then allows us to ask questions using common dialects across conditions, drugs, procedures, measurements, what have you. So the basic approach that we're taking, which is not all too dissimilar from other distributed data networks, data sources are converting from their raw format into a common data model. We've then developed open source analysis software, generally going to be packaged up as like some sort of R package that any site can download, execute, and generate summary statistics. And then those results are put together into results repositories that are made publicly available for everybody to take advantage of. We've now in the Odyssey community developed a pretty robust set of analytics tools. These have collectively been downloaded from CRAN over 250,000 times across different institutions. And really these are just building blocks to enable us to take advantage of the data. The real theme that I'm trying to share with you is that data isn't the end game. It's data plus analytics is going to provide us the mechanism to actually get to evidence. One of the other things that's been kind of a core tenet in our Odyssey community is to think about open science as it relates to transparency. And so I know one of the things that Dan mentioned that many of you are interested in specifically is how do we think about clinical research from the perspective of standardizing and making available protocols. And as we think about research across that entire continuum from data to evidence, we think about everything from how did one convert their data into a common representation, the ETL documentation being publicly available, any data quality procedures that have been executed and evaluated to prove the validity of data. The protocol for a given analysis itself should be pre-specified and registered and made available. The code that implements the protocol should also be made available so that anybody could either review it or, if they're a participating site, be able to execute it. Study diagnostics generated by the code should also be made available so someone can actually determine whether or not the results are trustworthy. And then the results themselves need to be exposed and made available, not just cherry picked and put into a publication. But each of these steps is a technical and scientific activity that one can fully implement as a reproducible process. It's just a matter of will and deciding that this is something that we're going to do to get out of being a bespoke trust me science into something that we can actually believe is an engineered solution. So one of my main theses that I want to share with you tonight is that to solve this problem of reliable evidence, we need to get away from bespoke people thinking, or bespoke processes that involve individuals thinking that they can react to a given question, cobble together, curate, and then hope that the evidence they produce might be trustworthy. And instead, we need to be thinking together about how we not just be practitioners in maturing the curation of data, but actually the developers of systems that generate evidence from the data through the consistent application of standardized data processes, standardized analytics, and working together as a standardized network to generate evidence that kind of meets all of these criteria of reliability. So if I were to, Dan mentioned that my background is in engineering. And so when I watch my colleagues in epidemiology design studies, it's very much an artistic endeavor. Someone grabs a question about a particular exposure of interest in a particular outcome, and they think really hard about what's the best possible design. And then they think really hard about where they could get the best possible data. And then they try to massage it as best they can to believe that they're going to get a good answer. And I look at the process instead and say, well, the types of evidence that we want to generate are well-defined. The inputs are well-defined. We should have well-defined outputs, and we should be able to have objective criteria to walk through every step of the way to actually prove that our evidence is reliable. So a system that could run across a network of data would probably have steps that would involve, for example, systematic data quality evaluation, whereby there'd actually be pass-fail objective criteria. Some data will not be fit for use for a given question, and that's okay, but that should be a defined a priori process. Phenotype development evaluation is critically important to be able to actually know that you're identifying the right clinical idea from your data. This is still extraordinarily complicated for most organizations, and there should be objective criteria that we can evaluate and diagnostics that we can apply to understand whether or not we trust that we have adequate understanding of misclassification error in our analysis. And then analysis reliability. We should be able to conduct studies and actually have diagnostics that tell us whether or not we can trust the statistics we produce. And only after you've gone through those objective processes consistently across your data network, should you actually unblind your results, just like a clinical trial, and look at the answers to your questions and be able to actually trust them and actually explore that evidence with confidence that you don't have to go back and say, I wonder what about data quality, or I wonder about whether or not this statistics is valid. Now, I'd suggest that this could be engineered, and part of that is because we've seen across the research community bits and pieces of this tackled by the informatics community in particular, just not necessarily combined together in one composite solution. But we've seen lots of great work from informaticians in data quality assessment and in network analytics that are developing pretty cool tools as we speak. We've seen progress in open source software into cohort diagnostics and phenotype evaluation across many different US data networks in particular, as well as in Europe. And we've seen tools for applying large-scale statistical models at scale that produce study diagnostics that can be evaluated as best practice. And we have software now that, of course, generates results of individual studies. So it's not a matter of that each of these pieces is impossible. It's really a matter of putting them together and thinking about a system that's actually applying objective criteria to generate this evidence at scale. Now, we've been thinking about this in the Odyssey community for a while, because we actually recognize that if we don't trust the evidence that's generated, and it's all being generated in this bespoke process, that systems thinking might not only be a way to actually improve efficiency, but it might be the only way that we can actually improve reliability. This paper that was published by my colleague Martin Schumi a couple of years ago was an investigation into how bad is the current problem and what would a system solution look like in a particular clinical domain, which happened to be about depression treatments. And one of the nice figures that I really enjoy in this is this figure one that was in the paper. This top left-hand plot, what this represents, just to orient you to the plot, you're going to see a few of these. The x-axis is a relative risk estimate. So think of that as relative risk greater than 1, and suggests that a study had an increased risk. Below 1 would be a decreased risk. The y-axis is showing you a standard error. So think of that as how wide a confidence interval would be. The dashed line represents our nominal idea of p less than 0.05, our magical threshold that people use to decide that evidence is worth publishing. And every little black dot you see there is a published paper in PubMed. So we actually mined PubMed, extracted all the published observational studies that we could find, and we plotted them here. So this is 60,000 observational studies where we could actually extract out the effect estimate from the study. And what you can see is that most of the dots are below the dashed line. So this basically means people are more likely to publish statistically significant findings than null findings. We know about this effective publication bias. What you can also see is that the dots tend to be, they're skewed to the right. That is, people are more likely to publish increased risks than they are about decreased risks. You can see that the dots are suspiciously hovering right around the red dashed line. This is that phenomenon called p hacking, where you torture your data until you get to exactly p less than 0.05, and then you call success. And in total, the observational literature, these 60,000 studies, 81% of them had non-null findings. Clearly, this is nonsense. It can't be the case that every exposure is causing every outcome. Otherwise, none of us would ever take any medicines or have any medical interventions involved with us if everything was going to happen to us. But the reason for this is because every one of those dots is a bespoke process of somebody testing some hypothesis, generating some paper, and cherry picking the ones that they choose to publish versus not. Now, what we did instead, shown in this lower right hand, this lower plot, is we built a system that systematically explored the effects of depression treatments. We applied that consistently across all depression treatments for a predefined set of outcomes, and we published all the results. And what you see is this plot, which is startlingly different. Now what you actually see, every black dot is still a study, but now you see no p hacking because the system can't choose what information to share or not share. You see full symmetry because the system isn't going to decide that increased risks are sexier than decreased risks. You see most of the information actually is not statistically significant, which is reassuring because we really don't want all medical interventions to cause all outcomes. And we did this as a proof of principle to say, well, hey, what would happen if we built this system? What could we see? And we actually saw that we actually could start building confidence in our results. And we actually did this again, trying to develop systematic principles for how we could generate evidence at scale. We basically defined 10 rules of how one could use observational data to go through systematically answer research questions with a predefined set of analyses to generate evidence that we could then look at and interpret. And when we did this for hypertension treatments, we generated the following plot, much, much denser. We actually generated over 1.3 million study results. But we didn't just publish 1.3 million studies. We published a study that said, here's all the evidence in this space. And when we did that, you can see there's no p hacking. There is no publication bias. We're just generating evidence, and then someone can decide to explore this evidence systematically to determine what they learn. And this isn't just an interesting statistical exercise. What we actually saw is that we filled an evidence gap, that in the area of hypertension, most treatments had never been compared to each other through randomized trials. There was spectacular missingness in what we actually knew about which treatments were best for patients with hypertension. In our analysis, by doing systematic head-to-head comparisons of every treatment versus every other treatment across all of these databases, we started to fill that evidence gap. And this has actually now resulted in a whole series of clinical publications where we had really important clinical insights that we've now been sharing through publications, showing that, for example, thiazide diuretics are a better treatment, initial treatment than ACE inhibitors, even though ACE inhibitors are the majority of first-line therapy for hypertension. We showed that the speculation that chlorthalidone is a better first-line treatment than hydrochlorothiazide, actually that these treatments were largely equivalent. We showed that beta blockers indeed probably shouldn't be first-line therapy. Been able to show that angiotensin receptor blockers actually appear to be safer than ACE inhibitors. All of these are clinical insights that weren't generated by a bespoke study hoping to find a particular hypothesis, but by developing a machine generating evidence that can then be thoughtfully explored. Now, I know on time, I'm going to just skip ahead a little bit here. What I've highlighted here is one example of one kind of question, exposures related. There are a lot of different use cases for our observational data network. In Odyssey, we think about 3 use cases: clinical characterization, patient level prediction, and population level estimation. There's questions about what has happened to them, real world descriptive understanding of basic observations. There are questions about causal inference, and then there are questions where people are getting super hyped up about the applications of machine learning to try to answer questions about inferring what will happen to me. Now, in that regulatory speculation from the EMA, the statement in 5 years we'll start to use real world data, they outlined a set of use cases that they thought are ready for regulatory grade opportunities. They talked about supporting the planning and validity of clinical studies, understanding clinical context, and investigating associations and impact. Now, this is the context of how the European Medicines Agency was framing this, but I would actually assert for pretty much all of our organizations, everybody on this call, these are the same use cases we're thinking about for clinical research. How do we enable actually conducting prospective research? How do we learn from the population that we have? And how do we actually generate studies that are by themselves discoveries of associations and causal effects that can actually promote better care? And for these use cases, one of the summaries that I was interested in was, of all these cases, what do we really need to work on as a community? There are questions like designing the feasibility study that are clinical characterization questions. Generalizability of a clinical trial to a real world population is a characterization question. Disease epidemiology is a clinical characterization question. Drug utilization is a clinical characterization question. Effectiveness studies can be any of the fold, and impact of regulatory actions is a clinical characterization. The reason I share this mapping of the use cases envisioned for regulatory science versus the current state of is that most everybody gets worried about using observational data for causal inference, which is because what we use for clinical trials, and everybody's super excited about artificial intelligence and machine learning. But the bread and butter of what we can do with our observational data is to understand what's going on in the real world population. That is an opportunity that observational data actually provides that pretty much no other data source can provide. And it's actually the most compelling use case for the vast majority of what we actually need, whether it be regulatory policy decision-making, or frankly, at the point of care, understanding what's happened to them can inform what's going to happen to me. And so I actually think we're getting super excited about advanced statistics and novel approaches of data, and we're kind of missing the opportunity to think about these compelling use cases. I know I'm slow on time, so I'm actually going to suggest here, Dan, that I'm going to skip ahead for just a second because I'd like to make sure we do have time for conversation here. Part of this challenge for the EMA is they said in 5 years they hope they can do some of these things, and I'd actually assert we already do all of these things today. We just don't do it systematically and we don't coordinate our work. But I have demonstrated examples that many of you are probably a part of that proves that this can be done. It's just a matter that we're not coordinating it, we're not standardizing the network, we're not standardizing our tools, and we're not generating analysis. What I want to highlight is one last thing, and then I'll stop to highlight this, is I would assert that the reason we're not doing systems thinking and systems application of evidence is because we inherently aren't trying to be proactive in the use of our data. We are collecting data, we're trying to make it available, and then we kind of make it someone else's problem to generate evidence. And as a result, we are reactive. We treat questions as if they are things that are bespoke service requests. Somebody asks the question, then we start the process of figuring out how to answer it. But the opportunities of standardizing data means that we can become enabled. We can actually design and execute standardized analysis to generate evidence more quickly. We could become responsive. That is, we could enable fast evidence generation, having like user interfaces that actually allow someone to define specifications to answer questions quickly. We could be prepared, meaning we've already pre-computed the answers to questions and they're available on demand. Or we can become anticipatory, actually delivering insights into the hands of decision makers at the time they need it, before they even ask the question. What this requires is not only standardizing data, but standardizing analysis tools, standardizing analysis configurations, and standardizing our approach to disseminating evidence. What this means is that we can accelerate the time to evidence, not the time to data, not the time to access, but the time to evidence, the time to answers, from what is currently something that takes weeks or months or years, to having systems in place where in a few days an enabled network can generate an answer. In a few hours, someone could be responsive to a question. In a few minutes, one could look up an answer, or in a few seconds, the answer could already be in hand. I had a mentor many years ago who said, at the time I ask a question, that's the time I want the answer. And I think, many of you all are in important clinical decision-making meetings for your health institutions. And the idea that when someone asks a question that it's okay to say, yeah, I'll get back to you in a few weeks or months or years is just completely unacceptable. But somehow we live with like, that's the best we could do. And I would actually assert that if we are true stewards of our data, we actually need to be stewards of the evidence that could come from our data and take accountability and responsibility for developing the systems so that we're not just managing a research warehouse, but we're actually managing the enterprise of evidence generation from that research warehouse and actually delivering the evidence and insights and building the confidence of that evidence to everybody that's involved. What I've done, and I'll stop so we can talk here. What I've done is thought about what realistically could we achieve as a community. What I've come to the conclusion of is that if we want to do any of those regulatory use cases, or if we want to actually have our evidence directly impact clinical care, we have to become proactive in generating evidence up this scale. We can't be doing this reactive approach. And the only way you can actually generate evidence at scale is if you take systems thinking into account and build the systems that generate evidence instead of having people and processes reacting to individual custom questions. So I know we've only got like 10 minutes left, Dan. So why don't I stop there so we can have some conversation?
That sounds great. And while we are, while we're working through the chat, let me just start and see what are your suggestions about how we're going to deal with the publication bias issues, which are, I don't know, it's hard to imagine that the clinicaltrials.gov approach would work because it's hard to do the registration, but it's possible, right? You could do something like that. I think your systematic approach of saying, well, here's a database and we're going to look through every possible combination and look at it in large is good, but then you wonder about, well, how many different databases there are? How do you deal with that issue about, again, duplication when EMR data is in one data set and another data set, try to do that. So I don't know, what are your thoughts about how to do, because of all the things you said, that in some ways is the one that worries me the most. The easier it is to do the data analysis, if we don't deal with the non-publication bias, we're going to create we're going to go off track.
I think you're spot on, Dan. I think one of the things that bothers me about our current evidence dissemination paradigm is the primary thing that we look towards is peer review publication. And the idea that we all live in organizations with live dynamic data all around the world, and then we decide that that's the best format for that is in a static PDF 8.5 by 11 document in a journal article behind a firewall that most people can't reach is kind of asinine. If we instead said, like, forget about publications for just a second, let's try to use the world's data to generate as much evidence as we can and get it in the hands of decision makers at the point that they're making their decisions. We would want to make sure that there's a responsible process so that only good evidence is in their hands. But do we really believe that the peer review process that's going on right now is the way to solve research integrity? I mean, that's just crazy.
Right.
But I think what that requires us to do as informaticians in particular is for us to think about different ways of disseminating evidence. So it's not just the peer review publication process, much like how do we actually get evidence in the hands of decision makers? And this is not just clinical decision support systems. This is actually thinking about evidence repositories that are living objects being contributed on a live basis from data, and ways for that information to be exposed and accessible through a variety of different media.
Yep. So other questions? I can't see her in the chat, or did they come in? And if someone wants to
We have a question from Alan. What a great point perspective on peer review. Abs static PDFs need a disruptor. Alan, would you like to unmute yourself to elaborate on that point?
No, I'm just wondering, like, you know, is like are the preprint servers maybe a step towards some of that disruption that, you know, I think, Patrick, to your point, you know, we're so old fashioned and wanting these PDFs behind some firewall when really need to, you know, get more information now, democratize it better. But I guess old habits die hard.
Yeah, I think, Alan, one of the things that we do have to be careful of, but I think, you know, if you reflect on it for a second, it's kind of obvious that the silliness is we generate statistics, and then what do we do in a publication? We write our own subjective opinion about the statistics in a discussion section. If we think about that, where is our concern? It's usually in the subjectivity. Like, why am I a peer reviewer of these papers? It's because I want to make sure that someone, when they impose their subjectivity, that they didn't actually, you know, take a step too far. But if we turn this into a fully objective process, I don't need their subjective interpretation. I need an objective statement of fact. And if that's the case, well, I can actually build a machine that'll write papers. I don't actually need a human in the loop to give me their subjective biased opinion. And actually, for the legend thing, we actually did this as a proof of principle. We actually wrote a software application that on demand, if you click it, it'll write a paper for you. If you didn't know, you'd think the paper was written by a person, but in fact, all it's doing is just showcasing evidence at scale. We didn't do that to publish 1.3 million papers. We did it to kind of prove the farce that is our current evidence generation process. And I think all of us as leaders in our communities, we actually need people to start thinking, well, what's the point of generating evidence? I don't think it's just to increase our H index on Google Scholar. It actually is to generate knowledge that we hope is actually going to be like useful for somebody in making an informed decision, in which case we need alternative ways of getting that evidence out there.
Yeah, you know, I've thought sometimes, like, take one of the standard cardiovascular databases and you pay people to replicate, right? And not to publish, it's just, that's your job, right? This was published, you're going to take the framing and whatever and try to replicate it and take it out of the academic productivity. And I mean, just the last thing, sometimes I think trainees are a little bit more of the problem than solution, because, you know, you want to find a publication for them, they're trying to do it. And I think maybe we're even giving them the wrong idea, right? Go look at a few things and then find out which one to publish. That's another real problem when you're so focused on the publication. You know, maybe we have to disambiguate the publication and academic achievement, right? Or for evidence, right? Publications for evidence.
Yeah, when I give this kind of pitch about systems thinking, one of the pushbacks that I hear, particularly from non-informaticians like epidemiologists or policymakers, is that bespoke custom study is really well thought through and well designed, and there's no way you could engineer a system that could generate the same quality of evidence as that expert. And my pushback to that is twofold. Number one, think about where most of the evidence is currently coming from. As you say, Dan, it's usually coming from the trainees. You're giving someone the learning experience to try to figure out how to do a study. And it's under, strong mentorship and what have you, but really, how many students have we all had where, did you actually check the SAS code of your students when they published their first paper? Probably not. And so you don't really know the rigor by which it was generated. But secondly, building a system does not mean taking shortcuts or simplifying things or making less advanced statistics. It's actually harder. Engineering a system to account for everything actually means that instead of doing those bespoke studies, we have to come together and think super, super hard about exactly how to generate evidence correctly. A thinking that's an order of magnitude harder than doing a one-off study. But if we do it once together as a community, then we can actually have confidence in it, rather than having dozens of trainees out there all basically scurrying in their own directions and hoping that they might get a right answer.
Yeah. Any other questions, Andrew, that you can see? I can't see the chat. Or
Sure, let me just take a look here. We'll just give it a few minutes. Also, folks, you can unmute yourself and turn on your video to ask questions. Maybe Patrick, if you don't mind taking your slides down,
Please.
then folks can see each other. And there we go. We got a nice group here. So please, this is your opportunity. Go ahead. Ask Patrick whatever you would like.
Well, I have maybe a very boring and basic question. We've implemented OMOP at Hopkins, starting to use it. But I'm still suspicious because I've wallowed in the data for so many years. So my question is, does OMOP have a mechanism for assessing the quality of the data, the consistency, gaps, those sorts of things? Because honestly, when I've worked with, we work with Trinetics, and they were able to run some statistics and sort of point out where there were issues in the data. And I found that extremely helpful, because you can have data and it's jammed into a model and it's networked with other people and it's got all these great tools. But if you put garbage in there, it doesn't matter, right? What you're going to get out is, what it's going to be. So, so I'm wondering if OMOP has tools, just as you're putting data in there, to sniff out where there are problems. Because really, that's what gets us a lot, is the data as we collect it in the medical record was suspicious. And sometimes you can tell that, but sometimes you can't. Sometimes there's bias in how it was collected. It's collected in one place, but not another place, or with a certain sort of assumption in mind. So anyway, have at it. I'd love to know a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think there's two aspects of that we focus a lot in the Odyssey community around. First is what I will call data quality. So we have tools that actually are providing judgments to evaluate using Michael Kahn's framework about conformance, completeness, plausibility, where we've built explicit checks that run against your CDM instance to actually provide you a report that says, here's what checks you passed or failed. And we actually promote that isn't just an activity that you should do as a data steward, but actually it should be part of the final evidence report. So when you give an answer to the question, you can also say, here's the 4,000 data quality checks we've done, and here's how many we passed, and this is why you can actually trust those dimensions. The second part of it that I think is actually important is quality usually comes with it some sort of assessment of judgment. That is to say, it's good or not, it passes or fails. We also think it's extremely important that you do data characterization at the population level, and then also at the cohort level, like whatever is your target population of interest. And so at the database level, we've developed a series of tools in Odyssey Community that systematically go through table by table, field by field to produce marginal statistics. And we use those both to allow an individual site to just understand what they're seeing in terms of temporal consistency across time, density of particular data domains, but then also to be able to put that across a network so that you can actually benchmark across others. So you can understand, is your data density consistent with other data density? And that's not necessarily a quality thing. We don't know that it's right or wrong. It's just it's a characterization, a reality of what's going on. And we think that those are essential elements that precede the point where you're actually, like when I laid out the 3 stages of data fitness for use, phenotype development, and analysis, that's really at that first stage. You really need to systematically understand which data are appropriate for your question and create objective criteria to say, like, suitable for my particular needs.
So Patrick, I'll wait if I don't want to ask all the questions, but it's good. So how will you know whether the FDA, when will you feel like the FDA is really accepting real world evidence in the regulatory? Is it new indications? Is that where you think you'll know that the FDA has a real belief in the validity of real world evidence?
I think we're already there. It's just that not everybody's seeing it yet. I'll provide one specific anecdote that Odyssey was directly involved in just this last year to kind of bring it full circle to Rob Califf's argument of why are we doing this for COVID. Many of you may recall when our former president was telling everybody you should take hydroxychloroquine, what do you have to lose? And then there was concerns about whether or not hydroxychloroquine actually worked to reduce effects of COVID. But then there started to be concerns about maybe hydroxychloroquine was actually unsafe. Well, the Odyssey community was the leading group that actually performed the safety assessment of hydroxychloroquine and determined that hydroxychloroquine in combination with azithromycin would increase cardiovascular mortality. The EMA issued their risk communication on that basis, and they explicitly cited the Odyssey study, which was only in a preprint on medRxiv, but they cited us and said, we don't recommend the use of hydroxychloroquine because observational studies are saying there's a problem. The FDA issued their risk communication 1 day later, and FDA just has a policy of not citing work in their communications, but it's very clear that came from us. So there's a case where regulatory action was taken. There was no clinical trials that were done on hydroxychloroquine for many weeks thereafter. And those studies were not powered to actually identify that concomitant increased risk. So when push comes to shove, when there's absence of evidence, real world evidence is going to need, it does and is going to need to fill the gap. The question is going to become, when can we actually satisfy using real world evidence as an alternative to clinical trials? And I think there's a false dichotomy of thinking that it's one or the other. I think we need to think about complementary evidence, but we need to really be much more aggressive in pushing real world evidence as something that should have a seat at the table, rather than something that's of last resort or always regarded as the inferior quality item.
Great.
So I just want to say we have time for a few more questions. I have been told that in 5 minutes we will be getting kicked off the platform, though. So if you were thinking of a question, but you were going to sit back and see, how things went, don't do that, please.
Right.
There we go. Guanangang, excuse my pronunciation of your name. I think he has a question. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Andrea. It's great. I'm gonna thank you, Patrick. It's great conversation, and the content is really helpful. I think I listened to several of your talks. Really helpful. I'm from Yale, so I've seen there's great efforts from the Odyssey community that and also a great adoption internationally, like from South Korea and also Asia and Europe. So I just wondering, what is your what have you seen the progress in the U.S. That what is the percentage that from the U.S. research organization has adopted to OMOP CDM, and what is your vision in the future from the research perspective? What do you see in the future from the US? Maybe how should all these organizations collaborate together and generate evidence?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and Dan kind of alluded to this in his intro comments. You know, many academic research centers were not participating in any networks, and then we saw over the last decade so many different efforts pop up, whether it be, you know, ACT or Sentinel or PCORI or any of these efforts, and then we saw this demand on many of you all that you went from not having to participate in these kind of collaborative efforts to then suddenly be inundated with these requests. And with every one of those requests came a new ETL process, a new maintenance, maybe a duplication of your data, issues of, are you participating in a distributed network or are you centralizing your data in something like N3C or what have you? And so it's kind of endless. What I'd say is an observation of mine from an international perspective is that in the United States, we went from not many of these opportunities to many of these opportunities. And many of the data networks in the United States have done some interesting methodologic work, but frankly, most of them have underdelivered in terms of their impact to patient health, in terms of the actual clinical evidence generated. And that's because a lot of those data networks, their focus was on building a data network, not taking it all the way to being an evidence network. In contrast, the work that we're seeing, for example, in Europe, that's largely driven on like regulatory use cases, the goal is the evidence, not the data network. The data network is subservient to the evidence that is necessary. And so there isn't a goal just to have a network so that you can claim you have a network. The metric is about the impact that you're actually having in solving public health questions. And certainly in Asia, we're seeing that the motivation that's driving a lot of the collaboration is joint interest in publishing papers of high clinical impact. That is really what's motivating things. So the data is kind of the unnecessary or the unsexy part that enables the evidence to be produced, as opposed to the data network being its own solution. I think in the US, where we actually need to center is we need to look all of our networks, including what we look at in Odyssey, and say, like, are we actually generating enough evidence for the investment we're making in our data standardization and our network capability? You know, there are many, many hundreds of millions of dollars that have been spent on things like PCORI and ACT and Sentinel and all of these efforts. And comparatively speaking, one could say, well, maybe I'm better off with my trainee just having my own access to my own database and publish their own one-off black dot in our sea of nonsense observational studies, because it's a lot more work to do this network-based approach. So I think we really need to repivot a lot of these network conversations to not about who's got the most data or the best data standards, but instead really center like who's actually demonstrating the capability to go end to end to the evidence and proving the evidence is worthwhile. And I think if we in the US start focusing on that problem, we can probably make a lot more headway.
So
Right. Well, Andrea, is that it? I think
we might be getting kicked off at any minute.
Yeah.
I just want to
I
let
don't want us to
everyone
get-
know
that's
that
right.
through the platform, you can send messages to Patrick. You can send messages to each other. You can continue to ask questions.
Right.
We'll be posting Patrick's slides as well. You will come back to the same place where you are now and you'll see files, and that will be his slides as well as a recording of this session. Dan, you want to final words, please?
Yeah, I just want to thank Patrick again for a great talk. I think it's a great setup, and really, I mean, at least for me, this is the next step, right? Is how do we make use of it? And we're going to have to change the way we do science, I think, and the you know, how we deliver evidence, and it's going to be a challenge for all this, but I think it's a reflection of these data networks that we didn't have before, and you know, how we're going to make sure they get used right. And so thanks again, Patrick, for getting us started. And for all of you, if you haven't looked at the agenda, we're starting at 10 Eastern Standard Time tomorrow, but it opens at 9:30 for coffee if people want to log in and you know, have a chance to communicate with each other. I know it's not the same as our nice little coffee clubs and when we would be able to sit around. I mean, I really enjoy kind of finding out what's happening with people in different institutions. We're going to come close to that. We have some different things planned to work, to communicate with vendors. We have a unmeeting kind of format at the end for new topics that come up. But again, thanks for everybody being here tonight, and we will see you in the morning.
Thank y'all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.